Archthrones is a mod for Dark Souls 3 that takes great inspiration from my personal favorite game in the franchise, Demon's Souls. Before we dive deep into the mod, I do have a couple of things to say. The first is that I was already halfway through my first script for this video when a patch was released that rebalanced everything. However, most of my gameplay footage is from my first two playthroughs, which I gathered prior to the patch's release. I did play the mod again on version 1.1, which at the time of writing is the most recent version of the mod, so I do have some footage from that as well. Just so the versions are clearly distinguished from one another, I am going to be putting a bright red asterisk on the corner of every piece of footage I took prior to the patch. The second thing is a brief explanation as to how I have structured the video. The demo, though only a preview of the mod, is massive, so to keep things organized, I will start by talking about the mod's installation and its dedicated servers. From there, I'll be giving an overview of what the mod has to offer and its new mechanics. After that, I will go from area to area, talking first about the tutorial, then the Nexus of Embers, followed by each of the Archthrones. There will obviously be spoilers in this video, so if you were thinking of playing Archthrones' demo and haven't already, I strongly recommend you do that before watching this. Now with that having been said, let's get into it. Installing the mod is as straightforward as can be. From the official webpage, there's a link that'll take you to Nexus mods. Here you can choose to download the files manually or use the mod's designated installer. I personally use the installer, but also have the manual files downloaded just as a backup. I am glad that the developers included the installer, as they can reach a wider audience of players who may not be that tech savvy or lack the patience to install a mod themselves. That being said, installing the mod manually is very easy. All you have to do is follow the README file's clear instructions, which essentially say drag and drop the files into a clean installation of Dark Souls 3. As for the servers, they seem to work fine most of the time. For about a fifth of my free playthroughs, I was unable to connect to them, which I was anticipating considering there was probably a huge number of people using them. When I was connected, I found that messages, bloodstains, and summon signs would go through without any issues. I only summoned one person throughout my entire time playing the mod so far, and they connected to my world without any issues. I must say, I am glad that this mod has its own servers, because it certainly sucks getting shadow banned trying to play the game modded with some friends. Archthrones can be described as a spiritual successor to Demon's Souls set in the universe of Dark Souls. The mod is composed of areas recognizable from Dark Souls 2 and 3, but they have been radically transformed both visually and functionally to provide the player a fresh experience. As for the mod's inspiration from Demon's Souls, that can be found in how the world is designed and in the future plans for player and world tendency. To those of you who've never had the chance to play Demon's Souls, be it the original or the remake, the game is broken down into 5 worlds, each with its own set of levels. Upon beating the first boss in Boletaria, the first world, the remaining 4 worlds are unlocked for you to go through in any order that you want. Each of the Archstones, as they are called, are certainly possible to beat as soon as you unlock them, but in general, some of them are harder than others. The Shrine of Storms and Valley of Defilement, Worlds 4 and 5, are relatively harder than Boletaria, Stonefang, and Latria, Worlds 1, 2, and 3. Archthrone shares this approach to world difficulty, but more on that when we get to reviewing each individual Archthrone. As for world and soul tendency, these features are not yet implemented, so there's not much to say about them. There are plenty of great videos explaining how world tendency works in Demon's Souls if you are curious, but the short explanation is dying whilst in human form makes the game harder by shifting the world's tendency towards black. By killing bosses in that same world, you could shift the tendency to white, making the game easier. Unique events occur in both black and white tendency, and unless you know what you are doing, it is hard to experience both in a single playthrough, thus encouraging multiple playthroughs on the same character. There is much more to it than that, but that's the general idea. As for tendencies implementation into Archthrones, I do not know exactly what the team is going to do, as it was a controversial feature for some people, but I do imagine that the mechanic is going to be similar to how it was in Demon's Souls. Additionally, the mod has new, fully voiced NPCs, the voice acting of which is phenomenal and immersive. There are new weapons and armor sets, some of which are custom made. The mod also features new bosses and enemies, most of which borrow attacks from other titles, but their moves are modified into something unique for Archthrones. The mod also has its own lore, includes custom-made areas, and has plenty of references to the previous titles. One of my personal favorite features of the mod is the Demon's Souls-inspired loading screens. and while there are only 3 of them as of now, the artwork featured in them is fantastic. Now, when I began playing the mod, my initial reaction was that it felt like I was playing a fanfiction, and that it was somewhat cheesy. This feeling, however, quickly faded once I interacted more with the world. There has clearly been a lot of love put into the characters in the world of Archthrones, and as a writer myself, I do appreciate that. I am eager to see what the future entails for the mod story, and I am also considering making some lore videos for it later down the line. Just no promises about that. Now, this is where I have had to cut the bulk of my prior script. Archthrones 1.0 and 1.1 may as well be 2 different games in terms of difficulty. In typical Dark Souls fashion, the mod is hard, and if you were like me and played before patch 1.1, you probably also thought it was a bit unfair. While the mod may be far from perfect now, which is fine, it is a demo after all, it is much more enjoyable now than it was on launch. I do, however, want to briefly talk about the 1.0 version to highlight how great of a job the developers did at responding to the community's feedback. When the mod first released, only 2 of the 5 Archthrones were possible to complete right out of the jump because of how unbalanced the enemies were. Long story short, most enemies had way too much HP, did way too much damage, and hardly dropped any souls. After the patch, the mod is now far more in line with what you would expect from a modern Souls game set in Demon Souls' framework. The speed in which the patch dropped was also sooner than I expected, releasing a week after the demo dropped. The patch was also not some school nurse, ice pack level fix to the mod's difficulty problem either. It was a huge step in the right direction of resolving it, and with more feedback and community testing, I am sure the mod will be further fine-tuned in the future. As for new mechanics, a feature unique to Archthrones is the kindling system. Normally, in the base game, when a player uses an Ember, it gives them a simple 30% bonus to their maximum HP, restores their health pool to that new maximum, and grants them the ability to partake in the game's advanced online features. Archthrones modifies this system by allowing the player to collect kindling from certain bosses and equip them to earn specific bonuses that cater to their playstyle while embered. By default, the player will start with a kindling similar to the base games. The effects of the other kindlings are all listed on screen now, and while I've not experimented with all of them yet, I am sure that you can find a way to make them work well in a certain build. I found the kindlings that best fit my 3 builds with a default one, the Crusaders, Oracles, Nightblades, and Cannibals. I think that the kindling mechanic is a welcome improvement, and I believe it is a clever way to encourage people to place themselves in a situation where they are willing to risk lowering their world tendency for the benefits. That is, of course, assuming that once world tendency is implemented, embers will be treated in the same manner as stones of ephemeral eyes. One of the biggest problems with Demon Souls' approach to world tendency was the benefits of being in human form were consistently outweighed by the benefits of being in soul form. While having full access to your health bar was great, the chance of shifting the world tendency in a way you potentially didn't want it to, in addition to opening your world for invaders, was enough to convince most players to not be in human form, and even incentivize players to off themselves the second they recovered their bodies after beating a boss in the Nexus, where world tendency changes are not applicable. Hypothetically, kindling addresses this problem not by punishing the player for being embered, but instead actively rewarding them for taking the extra risk. The effects of being embered not only can enhance a build, but also can become a key component of one. While I potentially see this being unfair for invaders who might not be able to use embers themselves, I would assume that there will be a PvP arena that allows for both parties to use embers or duel amongst each other without them. I think a good way to address the issues of embers and invasions might be to simply require both the invader and invaded to be embered in order for an invasion to occur. Now, while this goes against the idea of invading others for embers, I think rewarding invaders with Covenant items and humanities is a suitable replacement for that. Archthrones also incorporates guard counters from Elden Ring. While I didn't make the fullest use of the mechanic, I did enjoy using it whenever I could. Power stancing is also present in Archthrones, and thank God it is. I have no idea why From didn't decide to include it in Dark Souls 3, as it was probably the best mechanic to come out of Dark Souls 2. Other mechanics include elixirs, which are acquired through a quest line you can access early in the mod. Unlike Elden Ring's tier system, elixirs in this mod are crafted with ingredients that can be found and farmed throughout the world. 2 of the same ingredient can be mixed together in a brew to provide a more potent effect, or 2 separate ingredients can be combined together to give 2 separate ones. Once a flask is filled, the player will have 3 uses of their chosen concoction before having to refill it. Even if you haven't used all 3 uses, you can brew another flask, but it will discard the previous brew. With that being the last major change to mechanics, let's move on to the first area, the tutorial. The tutorial is a wonderful introduction to what this mod is, a new experience built atop the existing foundation established by the other games and sprinkled with tactful references to them. A formula I would argue From Software themselves use. The opening area is identical in layout to that of the tutorial in Demon's Souls, but very quickly turns into something unique to Archthrones, but still reminiscent of Laffer Castle at the beginning of Dark Souls 3. Funnily enough, the tutorial is spotted with messages about the game's basic controls just like the main titles, but none of them really teach you anything new, as I doubt anyone who has never played these games before is going to be starting with a fan mod. Dying in the tutorial outside of the boss room respawns you at the very beginning after the patch, meaning you can be beat senseless without any consequences trying to parry the Lothric Knight in the second room if you really want to, like I did. There are a few items in the tutorial, though most of them are not applicable in the moment, but are useful down the line like the coins and souls. The boss of the tutorial is a re-rendition of the Vanguard demon from Demon's Souls, and the arena and moveset are borderline identical to the originals in the boss's first phase. I really enjoyed this part of the fight, not because it was fan service, but because the developers gave the Vanguard demon the moveset of the Stone Demons, which, as some of you may know, is borderline identical to the Vanguard demon's moveset in Demon's Souls. Additionally, the developers of Archthrones visually modified the demon to fit in with the theme of Dark Souls' Demons of Izalith, the design of which fit perfectly and felt both refreshing and familiar. The second phase of the fight sees the Vanguard lose both of its legs, just like the stone demons we find throughout Dark Souls 3. This is where I have some gripes, but nothing major. At the end of the day, the Vanguard demon is designed to kill you and progress the story. With enough skill and understanding of the game, however, you can triumph over the Vanguard and get its soul as a reward. This was how it was in Demon's Souls, and how it is again in Archthrones. The only issue I have with the second phase is the puddles of lava. They do an absurd amount of damage for what they are. Obstacles meant to momentarily stun you and invoke an instinctive reaction that briefly distracts you from whatever the boss is doing. In general, we see puddles like this used to deny free movement of the arena, chip a modest but consequential piece off your total health, and leave you temporarily open for an attack from the boss. Instead, stepping on these puddles will probably damn near kill you, if not outright do so, which, in my opinion, is just wrong. Unless you are a bumbling buffoon and choose to stand in one willingly, stepping in one of these puddles should be one of the many small mistakes that eventually lead to your demise, not cause it. I would personally recommend the damage of the puddles is halved as a fix to this problem. That is my only real issue with the Vanguard demon in Archthrones, and if you die to it, well, off to the Nexus you go. If you beat it, you get its soul, and are blown up and sent to the Nexus anyways. Congratulations. Death is unavoidable here, and while I am not asking for the mod to be exactly like Demon's Souls, I do think that getting a little something extra for beating the Vanguard would be nice. I am aware the soul is worth a lot in the early game, unlike the original Demon's Souls, and that you can get an axe transposed from it, but the axe requires quite the level investment, and it should. I'm not asking for much more, just maybe 2 Titanite so you can bring your starting weapon to +1 as an extra pat on the back for overcoming your first real challenge as it was in Demon's Souls. That is only an idea though, and at the end of the day, I'm indifferent to whatever comes of it. Moving on to the Nexus of Embers, I must start by saying this has become one of my favorite hubs in the series despite being a rework of the base game's Firelink. The lush greenery, open blue skies, and falling leaves combined with the mild colors of the Archthrones provide a sense of security and comfort that I think the base game's Firelink was missing. With the exception of the backrooms, alchemy chamber, and blacksmith's hall, the overall layout is identical to Dark Souls 3's Firelink, which itself draws inspiration from Demon's Souls' Nexus, one of the better hub areas in the series in my opinion. The music of the Nexus of Embers is beautiful, and while I am no musician by any means, carries hints of secret betrayal and the themes of Dark Souls 1 and 3's Firelinks, all while having its own unique identity. Sola's composer and the Archthrones team nailed the tranquil vibe of the best hubs in the series I've had, and in doing so, brought much needed spirit to what was an otherwise drab and lackluster region so significant to the game. As for the NPCs in the Nexus, this is where I had that initial feeling about the mod being a playable fanfiction. And let's not beat around the bush, it is, but that doesn't mean it is bad. The term fanfiction seems to have quite a negative weight attached to it by default, and to put it bluntly, that is because the word fanfiction is synonymous with cringe in the modern day, but I didn't cringe, nor was I put off from the mod by this first interaction. As for why I felt this way, that was because the first character you interact with, Erwin of Karim, is a fan-made character, voiced by a fan, and has his own story intertwined with that of established NPCs from the source material. Now let me preface this. The voice actor for Erwin did a great job, and his story seems to be a subtle nod to that of the Vinlands from Demon's Souls, which is perfectly fine. I only had this reaction because I had to take a moment to mentally register that the arena and Aigon from Archthrones are going to be different from the ones I already know from the base game. Part of me coming to that understanding, however, led to me thinking about how these characters were going to be handled, which, of course, momentarily broke my immersion from the mod as I thought about whether or not the team might have replaced the original voice actors, reused their lines, commissioned the original ones, or, God forbid, used AI voices. Now, I got over this feeling pretty quickly. The more I interacted with the world, the more obvious it became that the story and characters of the mod were all crafted with love and respect for the existing lore of Dark Souls. And thanks to the convoluted way reality works in these games, the world of Archthrones feels like it can naturally exist in one of the infinite alternate timelines. Returning to the Nexus, like previous games, it is filled with NPCs who offer a glimpse into the world, apart from Andre, who is exactly as he is in Dark Souls 3. However, what Andre says does not subtract or add to the world of Archthrones, and that is fine. Erebus, the mod's vendor, on the other hand, does. Now, this is not a lore video, but I do want to highlight how good of a job the developers did presenting the world through the use of NPCs. Erebus is a one-armed artist from Volgan, a place recognizable from Dark Souls 2 as a wealthy city home to many of that game's merchants and the Falconeer mercenaries. I must say I'm quite fond of Erebus. His voice acting and character are charming and unique. Just in visuals alone, Erebus conveys a story. His missing arm creates intrigue. His clothes, though in tatters, are finely made and suggest that at one point in time he was quite affluent. And if he, an artist, was to become wealthy from his work, that also implies that not only was he a master of his craft, but Volgan itself was a rich society that respected the finer things in life. These inferences are all reinforced by Erebus' dialogue. Despite being forced into the role of merchant just to get by, Erebus remains dedicated to his art and is curious of the world's luxuries, mostly in the form of booze. Erebus, however, is not the only character who gives us insight into how the world once was. Returning from Demon's Souls is Stockpile Thomas, one of my personal favorite NPCs in the whole franchise. Though unremarkable on his own, Thomas represents the common man, a nice contrast to Erebus' status as a famed artist. Thomas is no warrior, nor is he a saint or a scholar, yet here he is, stuck in the Nexus whilst the world plunges into chaos. As he did in Demon's Souls, Thomas again does what he can to help by looking after the belongings of the emissaries. I enjoy characters like Thomas because they are honest to a fault and offer us insight as to how an average man might cope with a world as grim as the ones found in the Souls games. He is a friendly man paralyzed by guilt over his abandonment of his wife and daughter. Yet despite that, he feigns optimism. He sees you and the others taking a stand against the fading of the fire and is inspired by the bravery. However, that inspiration does not translate into any major action of his own, nor does it mean he will ever have his life back should things return to normal somehow. From a gameplay point of view, Thomas is the player's storage box, and is only as useful as you make that out to be. He does offer an undead bone shard when talking to him, and while I am unsure of the exact condition that triggers him to do so, I believe it is given after beating your first boss, though anyone can feel free to correct me on that if I'm wrong. I personally enjoy having Thomas over some bottomless box, even if his character's story currently is just a copy and paste from Demon's Souls. As someone who enjoys being immersed into worlds, I find that the more human elements added to even the most trivial of mechanics makes you as a player more bound to the experience. Next is the Firekeeper, and as she is in the main game, she is your guide throughout this ordeal. She grants you the ability to use the Archthrones by binding you to the Nexus, and in turn herself. She also grants you the ability to level up, and gives you 2 items currently useless in the demo but will be later on, those being the items which read the player's world and soul tendency. As with the other voice actors, the Firekeeper's voice actress did an outstanding job. Her appearance is fitting of the reworked Firelink Shrine, and the bits of story and guidance she offers the player are both concise and useful. Also in the Nexus is McLoif, the god of medicine and drink. McLoif can be accessed upon giving Erebus the wine found in Carthus and buying the key to his chamber. McLoif has little patience for the player, but comes to accept that helping them is the only way he could practice the very craft he rules over. To start mixing elixirs, simply unlock his chamber and defeat the Red Phantom who invades upon your next return to the Nexus. Defeating the invader, who is a fine fight, rewards the player with an empty flask which can be brought to McLoif. From there, show him the ingredients you have gathered and brew them into whatever you desire. McLoif, interestingly enough, also has some ties with Erebus, the specifics of which are currently unknown. Regardless, McLoif sells the dew of a primordial arch tree, which can be given to Erebus in exchange for a wider expansion of his shop. The price of this due is quite steep, but getting it allows the player to buy infinite small titanite shards and gold pine resins amongst some other things. After McLoif is the final NPC found in the Nexus until later in the mod, the Withered Man. The Withered Man is a rather interesting character, taking no interest in the player until they have a certain hollowing level. From there he'll offer the player the Dark Sigil, which you can give back to him and return at any time in the demo. If you accept the Dark Sigil, you can buy hollow spells which scale off of luck, and some various items that fit the hollow theme, including a staff that grants boosted soul absorption as its weapon art. The Withered Man is quite ominous, and like many NPCs, has his story develop later down the line. If you are interested in starting his quest, that begins at our first Archthrone, that of the Bountiful Queen. The first area of the Archthrone of the Bountiful Queen is the War-Torn Village, a reinterpretation of the undead settlement from the base game of Dark Souls 3. In terms of visuals, the level has gotten a major facelift. Gameplay-wise, there is a change in the order in which the player progresses through the area and some minor modifications to the level as a whole, but overall it remains the same. I must say, I have a newfound appreciation for the area thanks to Archthrones. I find the undead settlement to be one of, if not the most, boring and drab segments of Dark Souls 3. Going through the area in Archthrones, however, is exciting. Not only is there an ongoing civil war between the Knights of Lothric and those of Gertrude, which began over the prince's refusal to link the fire, but the inhabitants of the town have also gone hollow, some even turning into abyssal beasts, their corruption spreading to even the soldiers stationed in the lower dregs of the settlement. The atmosphere of the town is tense at its calmest and hectic at its loudest. The area is designed to put you into crossfire of the civil war, and while letting the enemies fight each other is an option, the victors of that battle will be something you have to deal with. Now, I did a lot of farming of the knights outside the village stable bonfire, and let me say, the outcome of who would win the battles adjacent to me was never the same even though my route was, and I love that. It adds a bit of authenticity to the area. Farming the knights is probably a good idea if you're struggling. Prior to the patch, I found it to be the best way to get souls, as not only did they drop a modest amount themselves, but you could also sell their weapons and armor, which drop quite frequently. Post-patch, levels are not as hard to come across, but farming the knights is still a good idea for embers and humanities, with the added bonus of getting a good amount of souls from the knights themselves and their extra bits of gear. As for the enemies as a whole in the War-Torn Village, I found these ones tended to be the most balanced ones in the mod. The knights are manageable if you approach them in small groups or one at a time, but pissing a lot of them off results in exactly what you expect. The Hollows are fine mobs designed to chip at your health, and the introduction of the Snakehead variant from Bloodborne adds a sort of elite version of them that plays quite well. As far as items go, in the War-Torn Village there's an Estus Shard, Undead Bone Shard, various coins, a longsword, and the Ember Blossom elixir material, used to boost the effects of embering and is in my opinion one of the better elixir ingredients. Additional Ember Blossoms can be obtained from farming the Lothric Knights as well. Hollow Gems can be gathered from Gertrude's Angels and the Angelic Maidens, and Fire Gems can be found from the Exploding Hollow Soldiers. Human Pus, another elixir material that prevents certain attacks from staggering the player, can be farmed from the pus-infested enemies. Also worth noting is the Angel Feathers, a third elixir material which can be found from the Gertrude Angels, and when mixed into an elixir gives the player passive HP restoration. Unless you combine the feathers with a full-on regen build, I personally wouldn't bother with them. Finally in the area is an injured NPC, Brother Lancel. He tells the player he, his Saint Aurelia, and his brother Nathan have come here in an attempt to convince Prince Lothric to link the fire. Lancel also gives the player access to the Way of the Blue Covenant, which can be accessed using the emblem he gives the player by presenting it to the shrine beneath the large tree at the start of the village. Upon joining the Covenant, he will be summoned to fight an invader before the entrance of the town. Once the invader is dead, the player can find Lancel's armor where they first talk to him. There are 4 bosses here in the War-Torn Village, and depending on which way you go through the town, you may stumble upon any different one of them first, which I personally think is quite cool. All of them in my experience are possible to beat upon their discovery. On my first playthrough, I fought the Siege Golem first, my second, the Pus-Ridden Beast, and on my third, the Angel of Gertrude. The Siege Golem is a boss whose design borrows mostly from the Iron Golem from Dark Souls 1 and the Tower Knight from Demon Souls. The Siege Golem's first phase is defined by slow, stomping attacks with wide swings of his axe. He deals heavy damage, but his attacks are relatively easy to read. Like the bosses the Siege Golem takes inspiration from, attacking his feet enough causes him to fall over, giving the player a brief window to hit at his head for some extra damage assuming they didn't get crushed underneath him when he fell down. As his health lowers, the Siege Golem casts miracles such as Divine Stars. These force the player to cease an attack and block or dodge, distracting them from the boss and potentially leaving them open for a swing of his axe. Additionally, the Golem will also teleport to the ends of the arena and cast a holy wave similar to Lorien in the base game of Dark Souls 3. Now, I never got hit by this attack, but I assume that the results would not be so good if you did. Miracles also casted by the Golem include brief but fast-moving rays of light, holy swipes similar to that of the Iron Golem's Wind Blast, and various slams and stomps infused with blessed magic. I think that the Siege Golem is one of the better fights in the mod. He is reasonably difficult, unique in design, and has a tried-and-true topple mechanic that is not only entertaining but satisfying. His theme is also fitting of his grand and angelic presence, and adds to the intensity of the fight. It is also worth noting that prior to patch 1.1, the Siege Golem had a nasty roll catch. This was thankfully removed, and with it being gone, so goes all of my issues with the Golem. The run back to this fight is essentially non-existent, as the bonfire is literally right outside the fog wall. Next is the Pus-Ridden Beast, which is instantly recognizable as the Cleric Beast from Bloodborne, only overtaken by the Pus of Man. In true Bloodborne fashion, the fight runs in a solid 30 FPS, at least it did in all of my playthroughs. Now, from what I have read in the official Discord server, lots of people seem to have performance issues with the war-torn village as a whole. I personally didn't have many, only a few frame drops here and there, but in the Pus-Ridden Beast arena my PC somehow managed to bamboozle itself into thinking it was a PlayStation 4.
What the?
PlayStation.
This change in FPS is the biggest issue I had with the boss, which I believe is a decent fight masked by technical issues. I'm unsure as to why these frame rate problems are happening. I tried changing my graphics settings to no avail. Additionally, I also encountered various visual glitches in this fight, such as textures in the backdrop clipping in and out. It is somewhat hard to accurately review this boss because of the lack of fluidity, which adds a layer of artificial difficulty to the fight. What I can say for certain is the Pus-Ridden Beast does borrow moves from the Cleric Beast, such as its slams, grabs, and various punches, but also what I believe are a few new ones, at least new to me, in the form of various dives and rolls. In the second phase, the Pus-Ridden Beast loses his legs much like Lawrence does in Bloodborne's DLC. The main difference being instead of leaving fire everywhere, he instead deals everyone's favorite status effect, Curse. Now the curse build-up in this fight is not terrible. In fact, prior to the patch you were more likely to die from the raw damage the puddles did in the same way as you would to the Vanguard, but that has thankfully been changed. The puddles still are dangerous, but in my experience the curse was more of a status to prevent you from hugging the boss's vulnerable backside. Despite being a boss from Bloodborne, I found the Pus-Ridden Beast pacing to be fine in Dark Souls 3. Visually, the Pus of Man aspect of the boss makes it fit in well enough with Dark Souls 3, as we have seen Beast from the Abyss take various gnarly and nasty shapes throughout the franchise's history. The music of the fight was also fitting and somewhat reminiscent of Bloodborne, exactly the kind of thing you would expect for a fight such as this. After beating the boss, the player gets a brief interaction with the Dancer of the Boreal Valley, who appears in the form she had whilst a phantom in the base game Xerophil. After talking to her, she gives the player a hidden blessing and vanishes. I thought this was pretty neat, and I hope to see more of her and perhaps Vort in the future. The runback for this fight is okay. Post-patch there is a ladder the player can use to get around the Winged Knight most of the times. The Pus of Man by the bridge is also easy to avoid considering he takes a moment to transform, and he also doesn't tend to follow the player very far. Next is the Angel of Gertrude. Now, as someone who has played Elden Ring quite a lot, I was quick to recognize this boss was a retextured Crucible Knight. Now, I didn't find that bad per se, but I didn't think it was too great either. Though the boss's moveset was hardly touched, I did appreciate the dedication put into the visuals of the knights and the arena. The fight takes place where the curse-rotted Greatwood is in the base game, but the arena has been greatly modified. The space is relatively smaller, beautifully decorated, and has two fountains which help to create distance between you and the angels, the second one appearing as the boss's second phase, and borrowing from the Spear Crucible Knight's moveset. Both bosses can be parried, and as it was in Elden Ring, I found this to be the best way to fight them once both of them were active. I'm unsure if this is just because Dark Souls 3 is a bit more particular about where you are standing when you parry than Elden Ring is, or if this was a change made by the developers, but I found the window and positioning needed to land a parry was much tighter in this fight, which, admittedly, makes it a lot harder, as the Crucible Knights in Elden Ring are a cakewalk if you happen to know how to parry them. The hardest part of this boss is the second phase. Both knights have the same speed, resulting in you shuffling around the fountains, breaking them up from one another whilst fishing for a parry or an opportunity to attack. The bosses also share a health bar, which I believe was the right call. This also means that if you find yourself struggling with one particular angel, you can focus your attention solely on the other one and still win. Now, other than being a retexture of an existing fight that is already overused quite heavily in Elden Ring, my only true criticism of the Gertrude Angels is I do think that the rate in which they teleport is a bit excessive. And when they do teleport, they group back up with one another, dragging the fight on longer than need be. I would recommend raising the cooldown on this attack by 10 or 15 seconds, and seeing how that changes things. As it stands, since both knights are of similar speed, it is very hard to separate them. I have a couple of ideas on how to potentially solve this issue. The first being to change the behavior of the knights so that they focus more on pincering the player rather than blindly chasing after them. Alternatively, changing their behavior to be more like Skull and Haiti, two bosses found much later on, might relieve the problem. And if that is a route that seems appealing, I would suggest giving the knight who is standing off an ability to cast a telegraphed heal, sort of in the same way Sister Fried does for Father Ariando. Finally, and probably the easier solution, is to simply lower the speed of one of the knights to help create more distance. The reward for killing these guys is something I must mention, as the sword and shield you can transpose from their soul as well as their armor are incredibly cool. If you play a paladin or holy knight, I strongly encourage you try out the angel's gear. In my first playthrough, I combined the angel's helmet, arms, and greaves with the herald knight chestplate to create a Way of the White Paladin. A look I would modify once the Gertrude Knight armor was added to the game with the patch for my third playthrough, which I think looks slightly better. The run back to this fight is manageable, but it does take some time getting used to. I found that baiting the two knights into fighting one another at the start makes it easier to slip past them, and that hugging the tree line to the right of the ballista also minimalizes the chances you'll get sniped by it. Finally, in the war-torn village is the Omen of the Eclipse, and man do I have some conflicting opinions on this boss. Had the first phase been it, I would have nothing but praise to say. The Omen himself is the captain of the Lothric Knights, corrupted by the pus of man which festers on his back. He does have Godfrey's moveset, but unlike the Crucible Knight, Godfrey isn't a boss that's recycled a dozen times in the base game of Elden Ring. Despite this again being a rehash, I still found the fight to be enjoyable, as Godfrey's moveset flows quite well in Dark Souls 3. The enjoyment I had for this fight was however fleeting, and I found myself frowning when the captain and his marvelous mustache morphed into an ulcerating tree spirit. I will stand by this opinion to the end of time. This thing was cut from Dark Souls 3 for good reason, as to why From decided to use it in Elden Ring genuinely baffles me. The thing is sporadic, causes the camera to become an obstacle, and has some of the wonkiest hitboxes I have ever seen. The Omen's second phase is terrible, and while I appreciate the team making the model smaller so it is easier to see, and the fight is way better than it was in Elden Ring because of that, I still think it would be better if the team did literally anything else with the boss in its second phase. There are two ways to return to the boss. The quickest is through a shortcut that brings the player back to where they first load into the area, and the second is by going through the sewers. Both are not terrible, but I do suggest unlocking the quicker route for obvious reasons, and the fact there are less enemies that way. The next Archthrone I suggest you visit after the Bountiful Queen is that of the Xanthos Scholars. Set in the Cathedral of the Deep, this world is a dark and sinister one, a stark contrast to the fiery color palette of the war-torn village. Hanging over the horizon is a massive full moon, and the further one progresses into the region, the more it becomes clear that this area is inspired by the cosmic horrors of Bloodborne. The layout of the area is identical to the base game's cathedral for the most part, and has only two bonfires, one of which you will be spending most of your time at, as it connects you to several key points in the level. The cathedral so far has the widest roster of enemies. On the outside of the cathedral, there are skeleton dogs, footmen, hags, evangelists, and abyssal iterations of the earful spirits and herald knights. Inside the cathedral, there are tiny and large deep accursids, cathedral knights corrupted by the void, and plenty of enemies from Bloodborne such as insectoid versions of the Blue Man group, merciless watchers, brainsuckers, and winter lanterns. The cathedral, while challenging, is a well-paced area with the harder enemies gradually being introduced one at a time. I don't have much criticism for the mobs here, but I do think that the Herald Knight's damage should be lowered just a bit, and that the Winter Lantern should have the radius of their stun scream reduced as well. As for items here, there are upgrade materials dropped from the various crystal lizards, the Cathedral Knight's set, weapons and shield, an Estus shard, the Help Me carving, humanities, various weapons, deep protection, and exploding bolts. There are way more than that, just those are the most remarkable items. Enemies here also drop green blossoms, deep gems, and the 2 large deep accursids each drop Aldrich's ruby and sapphire respectively. Also found here are the elixir materials Murky Moss, which boosts player absorption, and Celestial Pupa, which reduces FP consumption for a time. Trapped in a cell here in the cathedral is Yellowfinger Heisel, who can be freed upon finding the key in the torture chamber next to the Church of Sacrifices bonfire, which can be accessed from the lower floor or across from the elevator shortcut leading to where the Deacons of the Deep are in the base game. Freeing Heisel grants the player access to additional sorceries, and much like most other spell merchants, she requires scrolls in order to teach you new spells. Heisel is a fun character. She is enthusiastic about her magic and brings a jumpy, almost eager joy we don't typically see in these games. Upon freeing her, she can be found in the same room as the Withered Man in the Nexus. Returning to the Church of Sacrifices, we can find Preceptor Sharon, a finito who serves the Way of the White and wishes to see an end to the corruption of the cathedral. Sharon offers the player to join the Way of the White Covenant, and he can be returned to once they acquire any red rosary beads, items which can be exchanged for unique Covenant rewards. There are 3 bosses in the Cathedral of the Deep. The first I recommend fighting is the Great Deep Accursed, not to be confused with the Aldrich Spiders of the same name. This boss can be found where the Saint Bident is in the base game, and is heavily based on the Bloodletting Beast from the Bloodborne Chalice dungeons.
Bitch.
It has slow, semi-hard-hitting attacks and various grabs and slams. Hitting the Accursed's head, which lays low to the ground, is the best way to fight it in my opinion, as it frequently paves way for critical hits and staggers the boss. In its second phase, the boss begins occasionally using projectiles, some of which leave behind a bleed aura. These can be easily avoided, but standing in them can result in chunks of your health being sapped quite quickly. Aside from the use of projectiles, the only other substantial change in the second phase is the boss becomes more aggressive and visually transforms. The music for the fight is fantastic and is very reminiscent of Bloodborne's soundtrack. As for any issues with this fight, those are mostly just the inherent problems almost all large bosses have. The camera is constantly pushing and pulling from the character as it tracks the rapid movements of the boss. Now, while this does create a disorienting effect to make the fight harder, it is an artificial difficulty that is random and beyond the player's control should they use autolock. Additionally, I found that at times I would be dragged around by the boss, sometimes only a short, manageable distance, but every now and then I would be spun around and have the camera get stuck in one of its legs or into map geometry. Now, this isn't a problem with the boss's moveset, damage output, resistances, or health. In fact, compared to the other bosses of this mod, I found that this one was consistently the easiest one in all of my playthroughs. These issues simply arise with the fact that it's a large creature, and to be honest, the problems are not really that big of a deal, as they don't really happen that often, but when they do, they are more of a nuisance than anything. Killing the boss rewards the player with one of Heisel's scrolls, this one containing simple Farron spells. The return to this boss is arguably harder than the actual fight itself. From the Church of Sacrifices, you'll have to deal with 2 Winter Lanterns, a Cathedral Knight, the entirety of the Blue Bug Gang, a couple of Brainsuckers, and some statues that spew toxic mist. Alternatively, the player can take the first bonfire if they've opened up the shortcut. Now, all of these enemies can be dealt with or run past, but regardless of which approach you take, the run back will take some time. Even if you are confident that you can kill the boss, make sure you send the elevator back up once you reach the bottom just in case. Saint Kilm, the second boss in the cathedral, is found where Rosaria is in the base game. Kilm's first phase is that of the Godskin Apostle from Elden Ring, and like the Angels of Gertrude, I didn't necessarily mind that because of the thematic changes that were made. Now before we carry on with Saint Kilm, you may be noticing that a lot of the bosses in the mod so far are redesigns of fights from previous titles. Don't worry, I'll be discussing this later in the video. For now, try and hold any thoughts you might have about that. I personally found that Kilm's design as a man grub was a creative way to justify him using the Godskin Apostle's moveset. In fact, I found the moveset visually made more sense on Kilm than it did the funny pale guys in Elden Ring. Instead of Black Flame, Kilm throws razor flies and can apply maggots to the player to cause passive bleed buildup. A torch and red moss clumps will make the fight easier, especially if you come to him early on, as you may not have as many healing options at your disposal. This might be wrong, but I do think Kilm is slower than the Godskins in Elden Ring, and is overall easier to read. I also found he didn't do nearly as much blatant input reading when I reached for a flask. Kilm's second phase is where things get interesting. After performing quite the cinematic sacrifice of some lesser grubs, he turns into the one reborn from Bloodborne. During this ritual process, Kilm has heavily raised resistances, and there are puddles of bleed to stop you from interrupting him. So while damaging Kilm with ranged attacks is still possible, it is better to take this moment to focus on healing and buffing yourself instead. Prior to the patch, many of Kilm's attacks, most of which are his limbs spewing puddles and thrashing about to keep you away, did an absurd amount of damage, as did his ranged falling blood orb attacks. While I agree with the reduction of damage Kilm did as a whole, I found that the nerf to his falling blood orb attack was a bit excessive. Prior to the patch, this attack launched multiple projectiles that had a high chance of outright killing the player, which was not so good. Post-patch, the attack is now just a single orb that does modest damage. I think adding 2 more projectiles to the attack and keeping their damage as is would put the blood orbs in a much better place. Fighting the second stage of Kilm in my experience was best done with a longer weapon like a spear or halberd. The extra range on these weapons allows you to stand just outside the radius of the puddles or be barely in them while attacking him. Standing in just one place and attacking Kilm is a bad idea, as not only will he place puddles beneath you and physically strike you, but he will also attack you with divine arrows and his blood orbs. I found a good way to go about the battle is to run a loop around him and stab at each of his large limbs once or twice before exiting out into the outer ring and doing another loop. I would avoid attacking his smaller limbs because in my experience, unless you were directly touching them, chances are you are not going to be doing any damage, and touching them obviously means you're going to be trading damage. Kilm's arena is one of my favorite design aspects of this fight. The ritual chamber is not only visually appealing and suiting of his character, but perfectly complements both phases of his fight. In the first phase, the pillars are useful for deflecting his ranged attacks and creating distance between you and Kilm to regenerate stamina, apply buffs, or heal. In the second phase, Kilm is wildly immobile and takes up a great portion of the room's center. The ring around the pillars is useful for distancing yourself from his puddles and outrunning his ranged attacks. I've not had any issues with Kilm as a whole, but once he did have a hiccup when entering his second phase where he took a moment to begin his ritual. I don't know what caused him to freeze up like this, but it wasn't a big deal as it happened on only one of my 10 or so attempts fighting him, but I do think that it is worth mentioning just in case there is the potential for this to be exploited, as Kilm can still be damaged while this is happening. Kilm's runback is one of the longer ones in the mod. He can be accessed from both the Cathedral and the Church of Sacrifices bonfires, but the Church is slightly quicker and doesn't force the player to take any fall damage or fight too many lesser mobs. Finally in the Cathedral is Aldrich, who can be found where the Deacons of the Deep are in the base game. Archthrones' Aldrich is quite an interesting fight, as he combines aspects from many other bosses and turns them into something unique, all whilst being true to his original identity. Entering the arena will reveal that Aldrich is absent and that his health bar is steadily climbing from 0. Surrounding his tomb are 4 sermons of deacons, each led by an archbishop. Killing each bishop slows the rate in which Aldrich's health bar climbs, and killing them all and staying on top of their respawns prevents Aldrich from arriving with his maximum health. It seems that no matter what, Aldrich arrives around 1 minute after you enter the arena, so you need to be quick with the deacons. When Aldrich eventually does arrive, the deacons perish, leaving the player alone with Aldrich, who himself does very little physical damage and opts to cast spells and summon defensive globs in a manner similar to Rom from Bloodborne. Unlike Rom spiders, however, the globs behave more like the Phalanx's blobs from Demon Souls. They hardly pursue the player and instead take defensive formations around Aldrich, who is relatively immobile aside from teleporting to different sides of his coffin every now and then. When Aldrich does teleport, he casts swords beneath the player in a similar fashion to Nito. Prior to the patch, rolling was the only way to guarantee avoiding the swords, but now they can be avoided by sprinting through them if you have the timing down right. These swords, along with the Great Deep Orbs and Humanity Sprites, are Aldrich's highest damaging attacks, and they can mess you up, especially when they combine with the lesser projectiles from his little dudes. Additionally, Aldrich has a Cursed Rain attack that forces the player to back off of him, granting him time to resummon his allies or reposition himself. Prior to the patch, the Cursed Rain was a death sentence even with the Cursed Bite Ring equipped if you did not get ahead of it. This attack is one that probably won't get you post-patch unless you get stuck on the blobs or Aldrich himself, which is very likely if you are not mindful of them. Overall, I would say Aldrich is in a good place now after the patch. His attacks are more telegraphed than that of his blobs, but in general do more damage. If you let the blob situation get out of control, the fight will turn into a bullet hell. A suggestion I do have for Aldrich is to tie in his total number of active blobs to the total amount of lesser deacons on the field when he spawns in. As it stands, there is no incentive to kill the lesser deacons, as they do a poor job shielding the bishops and don't do much to get in the player's way. Having every one blob be worth, say, 3 lesser deacons as an example, would place the player in a situation where they can choose to focus on the bishops, and in turn fight an Aldrich with less health, focus on the deacons to prevent getting swamped in blobs, or try to balance the numbers to a point they deem reasonable. Another thing worth noting about Aldrich is his boss theme. Again, I am no musician, but I found that the theme did a great job at setting the mood and representing the deacons with the usage of a choir and Aldrich with a piano. The pacing of the theme matched the ever-increasing anxiety of the fight, and the unchanging motif of the piano symbolic of Aldrich subconsciously acted as a reminder to the player that his attacks are not changing, only the amount of them coming their way is. For me, Aldrich's boss fight was more enjoyable in Archthrones than it was in the base game. Despite the differences in execution, the core concept of Aldrich's fight remained the same. He is a boss that keeps the player moving, not because he himself is dangerous, but because his magic is. Because of this respect that the developers had for the original vision of Aldrich, they were able to create a fight that feels authentic to his character, rather than a fight with some goofy goober who happens to share his name. I hope to see that this remains the case with any other bosses that overlap with the base games on the mod's official release. The run back to Aldrich is not terrible, since the Church of Sacrifices bonfire is right there. If you don't have your timing down right, you might take a hit or two from the fat nobles, but running past them usually isn't a problem if you don't want to fight them. Following the archthrone of the Xanthos scholars is that of the High Lord, which brings us to Karthus of the Sands, a world built entirely from the ground up for the mod. Karthus opens as a massive desert full of sand-swept ruins and temples. Along the way, the player finds bells they must ring in order to unlock the main boss of the area. Greeting the player is Pyromancer Layla, who gives the player a flame and teaches them basic pyromancies. Layla also tells the player to be wary of the worm seen roaming about, which has been left unchecked since Karthus' decline.
Shots fired! Shots fired!
Visually, Karthus is an outstanding area, and I love the contrast of the open blue sky and warm sands, the sun in one direction and the moon in the other. Fundamentally, Karthus plays a lot like Elden Ring, only on a much smaller scale. The area is a vast landscape which can be explored in any way the player wants. You can choose to run straight for the bells scattered about the perimeter, and then head for the High Lord's temple, or you can explore the remains of Karthus in the Faerun expedition towards the Oasis. Also like Elden Ring, Karthus has a mine that can be explored, one with lots of open space for the player to fall into while walking along the narrow rafters or fighting the miners on the tight scaffolds. As one would expect, the desert is full of dangers. Scorpions, Karthus swordsmen, pyromancers, brutes, miners, and Faerun followers dart the landscape. The Faerun followers and Karthus soldiers are at odds with one another, a pleasant gameplay mechanic that doubles as a bit of world building, indicating that the remaining people of Karthus are not too fond of Faerun soldiers violating their sovereignty in search of abyssal corruption. Prior to the patch, Karthus was an area that required the player to fish for backstabs and parries. This was especially true for the Karthus soldiers, who dealt absurd amounts of damage and hardly ever were staggered. Post-patch, the area is way better off, but I did notice something I think is worth bringing to your attention. At this point in my third playthrough, I was two-handing the Iron Club. I found that the Karthus warriors, enemies who were rarely staggered in the past, were now getting staggered by just about every strike I landed on them. I then put 2 and 2 together, changed out my weapons, and saw the Karthus warriors had a more normal stagger rate. I'm unsure if this was meant to be the case or just an oversight, but using the Iron Club did trivialize an enemy that is meant to be harder than the average thing you stumble across. Aside from that, the Karthus warriors are some of the mod's better enemies post-patch. Both the sword and spear variants have a moveset which is backed up by the occasional usage of pyromancy, and both versions come with the famous Karthus Milk Ring, which, as it was designed to do, masks their movement and gives the warriors various opportunities for retaliatory strikes. But as to why Karthus was able to conquer so many lands was not because of this ring. I now know the true reason to be the fact that these guys mastered the art of delaying attacks. I can't tell you how many times I whiffed a parry or mistimed an attack or dodge because an attack I thought was coming my way was held a second later than you think it would be. Honestly, these guys make Morgoth's delayed attacks feel hyped up on Adderall.
What the fuck is a Calamity? No! Oh my god!
Now, once the Karfist soldiers finish pile-driving your embered ass 6 feet under the sand, you'll find that the pyromancers will come over and take your sarcophagus and turn it into glass. Taking one good look at these flame witches, and you'll notice that they bear an uncanny resemblance to the skeleton warriors in the catacombs of Karfist in the base game. Now, based on the fact that they carry the same shotel, stand with a similar posture, and are an enemy based in the same area, what do you think the moveset of these enemies would be? If you somehow said the Black Knife Assassin from Elden Ring, you would be correct. And when I first saw that, I was so caught off guard, I died within 30 seconds. Now, from what I have seen, these enemies aren't entirely based on the Black Knives, but they are rather a hybrid between them and the Karfist warriors of the base game. These enemies cast various pyromancies, attack quickly, create and close distances with long lunges, and are very nimble. The pyromancers are a more uncommon enemy, and unless you lead them into other mobs, you are more likely than not going to be fighting them one-on-one. In complete opposition to the speed of the pyromancers is the Drunken Brutes, who I've been told are based on the sumo warriors from Sekiro. Now, this may come as a shock, but I've not played Sekiro as of yet. Yes, I know the game is 5 years old, and yes, I know it's a great game, but incoming hot take, I don't think it's a Souls game. However, that is a topic for an entirely different video, and I don't really want to solidify an opinion on that until I fully play the game myself. Anyways, returning back to the Brutes, these enemies are slow-moving, delay their attacks, and cast various spells after having a swig from their flasks. They are tanky, hard to stun, but relatively easy to dodge. These guys tend to be guarding key locations and do not respawn. One can be found at each of the 3 bells in the open desert, and an additional one can be found outside of the High Lord's Keep. The one outside of the High Lord's Keep drops Karfist Flame Arc, the one nearest to the mine drops Poison Mist, and the one nearest to the Oasis Acid Surge. Additionally, the Karfist Red Wine, an item that can be given to Erebus, is obtained by the brute next to the bell left of the first bonfire. Other items of note in Karfist is the gear of the soldiers, dropped by farming them, as well as humanities and sharp gems. Chaos gems can be acquired from the pyromancers, and raw fire gems from the miners. Both the pyromancers and miners drop raw fire crystals, an elixir material that boosts flame attack temporarily. Finally, heavy gems, the follower set, and Wolfblood sword glass, another flask material that boosts damage to abyssal foes, can be farmed from the Farron followers. There is also an undead bone shard next to the acid surge bell, and various upgrade materials scattered about the desert. There are technically only 2 bosses in Karfist. However, I do have a rule I must abide by, and that is quite simply, if something has a named health bar at the bottom of my screen and has music, it's a boss. So that means that the Karfist Sandworm is also a boss. And with that, I now introduce you to the worst boss of Archthrones.
Alaskan bullworm!
If you have fought the Sandworm in the base game, then you already know how to fight this thing. Now, as a map hazard, I fully understand why this thing exists, and I'm okay with that. As a boss fight, however, this thing just isn't fun. And while technically it is optional, not defeating it means you miss out on an Estus Flask Shard and a Lightning Spear spell. You don't even technically kill the thing, you just beat it up and it leaves, assumably so we could fight it again later. You can also beat the thing in the open world just before the Oasis, which I did on my second character. I didn't even know the Karfist Sandworm was a boss fight until I accidentally stumbled upon its arena on my third playthrough. Speaking of the designated arena, it's alright. It leaves enough room for you to be mobile and avoid the worm, which is half of the fight in and of itself. The theme isn't bad either, it's just a fight I wouldn't exactly call worthy of being a boss without a radical rework. The run back also isn't so bad. From the High Lord's Temple bonfire, go outside and take a right. Once you pass the first dune, you are right back to it. The only enemy that'll be directly in your way is going to be a single Karfist warrior. After the Sandworm is the Chaos Immaculate, a reskin of the undead giant from Bloodborne found in the Karfist Red Mine. The Chaos Immaculate is a slower boss with hard-hitting attacks, which he later buffs with flames in the second phase. The boss is also relatively good at roll-catching the player, and has an attack that is timed in perfect sync with the player's dodge should they be panic rolling. The second phase of the Chaos Immaculate also has him routinely explode, showering the ground in fire puddles. Prior to the patch, these puddles did an insane amount of damage and lasted way too long, even forcing the player to move the fight to the other side of the already small arena just to avoid them. In the patch, however, the lava puddles were nerfed so hard that calling them area denial is just laughable. Multiple times I tried to stand in them to see how much damage they would do, only to find that they did nothing. The only time I was ever damaged by one of these was when the projectile itself landed on me, and that did an acceptable amount of damage for something that I got directly hit by. I know many people do not like bosses with area denial mechanics such as this, but I think that the Chaos Amagolet should have this kind of tool at its disposal, as it is a slower moving enemy with limited and quite readable attacks. Since this thing isn't throwing attacks out left and right at an insane speed, I think it is reasonable for the player to monitor where they are standing while simultaneously keeping track of the boss. As for specifics, according to the public patch notes, the lifetime of the area denial bullets was reduced by 92%. Now, I do not know exactly how long they lasted prior to the patch, but it felt as if the flames left behind by the attack stayed for about 9 seconds. Instead of this 92% reduction in lifetime, which makes the area denial a literal joke, the fire should instead last for a total of 2.5, 3-ish seconds, and do a third of the damage it did prior to the patch. This would keep the player momentarily cautious about where they are standing, but not outright kill them should they accidentally step in the fire. I also think that 1 or 2 projectiles can be removed from the attack, or that the overall area in which they land could be widened. As for the boss's music, the low horn immediately reminded me of the original Demon Souls' Flame Lurker, but that is where the similarities end, as this theme is its own unique assembly. While all the boss themes in this mod are good, I would say this is one of those themes that greatly enhances the quality of the fight. Appearance-wise, though this fight is a retexture, I do think it stands out. The fire crystals growing from the Amagolet are reminiscent of the growths on crystal lizards, which naturally paves way to ideas such as this thing once being a miner corrupted by the stones they gathered. Finally, the run back to the boss isn't bad at all, as there is a bonfire directly beneath him. If you stand for too long outside of the fog while applying buffs, you might get slapped by one of the miners if they chase you though. The final boss in Karthus is Necromancer Obadiah, who I believe mostly borrows from Malekith and the Soul of Cinder. Obadiah can be accessed in the High Lord's Temple after ringing all 5 bells, 2 of which are found in branching hallways inside of the temple and are guarded by the ghosts of Karthus nobles. Obadiah is a boss that takes the challenges the players faced in Karthus and condenses them into one fight. Like the Swordsman of Karthus, he employs a combination of quick, steady, and delayed attacks that have lots of weight behind them, and he backs up his attacks with dark pyromancies. Obadiah is also very nimble and makes use of his Karthus milk ring to both create distance and close the gap between him and the player. His first phase serves as an introduction to his moveset, which is expanded upon in his second phase. Opening his second phase, Obadiah will summon a wave of skeletons and take a standoff approach, opting to blast the player and his own skeletons from a range with pyromancies until either the player is dead or all of his skeletons have been toppled. Obadiah's skeletons are not that much of a danger on their own, and they will die in 1 or 2 hits from most weapons at this point in the game. The skeletons also do meager damage to the player, but if they are poorly managed, they can pave way for the player to be killed by one of Obadiah's stronger spells. After beating the skeletons, Obadiah will return to a more aggressive state and buff his attacks with Black Flame, which create lingering hitboxes on some of his attacks. I found Obadiah to be one of the better fights in the mod, and if he does reuse animations from other bosses besides Malekith and the Soul of Cinder, they were mixed so well I genuinely couldn't tell which fights they belonged to. Visually, Obadiah wears a garb similar to that of the Pyromancers, only his is black, most likely in reference to his dark flame.
Yeah, no shit, dumbass!
As for Obadiah's theme, it was great and had quite the Middle Eastern flair added to it, something quite fitting of not just him, but Karthus as a whole. The run back to this boss is also non-existent, as like many bosses in this mod, he has a bonfire placed directly before him. The Archthrone of the Old Gods is immediately recognizable as Hyde's Tower of Flame from Dark Souls 2, only it has various additions in the form of buildings from the profaned capital. Both prior and post-patch, this is the Archthrone that gave me the most trouble. This is an area that reverses the conventional Souls level layout and places all the harder enemies in the earlier and mid stages of the level. These enemies are mostly the same ones found here in Dark Souls 2, the Old Knights and the Hyde Knights, now called Phoenix Knights and Hyde's Queen's Guard. The Phoenix Knights have had a massive glow-up from Dark Souls 2. Their armor is no longer an oxidized mess, and instead is a gleaming gold fitted with red cloths. The Hyde Knights have a newly designed set of armor that remains relatively true to the original concept. Like in Dark Souls 2, most of the Hyde Knights are asleep, but when they are disturbed, the only thing they care about is whooping your ass. Now while the Phoenix Knights have the same moveset, this is where the Hyde Knights have also again been changed. They still have that unpredictable feeling to them, but rely heavily on guard counters and slow wind-ups. Both knights drop their armor and weapons, and prior to the patch, unless you wanted these things, it was better for you to run away from these enemies instead of fighting them. The damage, absorption, and health that these guys had prior to the patch was insane, and to add insult to injury, the Phoenix Knights dropped a comedic 200 souls, despite being twice as tough as they were in Dark Souls 2, a game where they dropped around 480 apiece. Thankfully, the mod developers caught onto this and modified the Knights, who now have far more reasonable stats and drop an appreciated 650 souls. I do think their damage can be reduced just a bit more, as losing around 400 HP in just 2 swings of their basic attacks seems to be a bit redundant. That having been said, I think that an overall increase in the Knight's difficulty from Dark Souls 2 is justifiable. I only disagree with how much of an increase was made. As for the other enemies in this region, there are 2 Dark Wraiths, both with rehauled visuals and movesets. The Dark Wraiths are far harder than any of the other enemies in the region, as they move incredibly fast and deal a ton of damage. One can be found near Irwin on a bridge next to the first bonfire. If the player summons the Hide Phoenix, that Wraith will disappear, leaving only the one in the Profane Tower. Other enemies in this region include Painting Guardians and Sunless Knights in the Cathedral with Quayla, the God of Dreams. In the Profane Tower, there are Cleaver Puppets from Bloodborne, retextured to be jailers, joined by revamped executioners from Dark Souls 2, who carry an axe and a crossbow. These enemy types are far weaker than the previous ones, so even if you are down most of your flasks, you can still manage to make it to the next bonfire at the end of the tower. Finally, there are Throwing Star Phoenixes, who I believe might use a moveset from Sekiro, but feel free to correct me if I'm wrong about that. These guys are really annoying on a fundamental level. They move quicker than the player can, react faster than you can swing most weapons, and barrage you with ranged attacks. The only saving grace of these guys is they don't do a crazy amount of damage, visually look cool, have an awesome repost animation, and make some of the most amusing sounds I have ever heard in these games. The Phoenix variant is also pretty cool, I can't deny that, but I do think these guys need to be slowed down to fit in with Dark Souls 3's pacing. The Phoenix Tower also has 2 NPCs you can assist or be assisted by, depending on what covenant you are in. At least, I believe that is the condition. Regardless, Sir Florian, a Knight of Quayla and a Blue Sentinel, will help you fight Kraton, who drops his axe upon his defeat in the large circular room at the intersection between the Cathedral of Blue and Dragon Rider in the base game of Dark Souls 2. A second summon sign can be interacted with in the Cathedral of Quayla, and can be found in the room leading to the Profane Tower. Using this sign will have the player assist Warden Jessa in her fight against Longfinger Kirk, who drops his sword and shield upon his defeat. Jessa and Florian can both be found in the chamber with Quayla upon assisting them, where Jessa will reveal she is a former Firekeeper turned Warden of the Pit of Sinners. Through Jessa, the player can abandon covenants and request absolution or dissolution. Florian will offer the player a chance to duel him and test her strength, and accepting the fight allows the player to fight him and Jessa in a boss battle, but more on that later. Items of note in the Phoenix Tower are Murky Moss, Lunar Cocoons, an elixir material that steadily restores FP over time, the weapons and armor of the Phoenix Knight, Hide Queen's Guard, Sunless Knights, Elite Dark Wraiths, and Painting Guardians. The Grass Crest Shield, starting sets for the Fencer and Knight, and the Chloranthie Ring can also be found here. Returning to Jessa and Florian, they are the easiest fight in this zone. They are a duo fight, with Florian having the flowing Nock Sword Stress moveset, and Jessa twin maces with moves from the Grave Warden Duelist. Both Florian and Jessa move at a similar speed. However, one tends to be more focused on the player at any given moment, whilst the other acts more passively. Both can be parried, and both don't do much damage or have too high of a health bar. Florian, I noticed, actually hits harder than Jessa, which I found quite funny considering she is using 2 massive maces and is nearly twice his size. The fight was fine, and is not too trying of the player. The rewards of the fight reflect this, and the player earns only a blue rosary bead and the option to join the Blue Sentinels. However, since there are no invasions in the demo, the Covenant has nothing to offer the player as of yet. I think the fight could be improved by tweaking Jessa to be tougher than Florian but far slower, because as it stands, both had comparable health, damage output, and mobility. Now, I am assuming these are just placeholders, but their combat audio is quite humorous. Jessa uses the same sounds as the Giants, whilst Florian uses the Nock Swordstress sounds. As for the boss theme, it was ethereal and matched the dream world that the duel occurs in. I do have to say that the song was quite loud though. For context, I play on sound level 3 for everything but the voices, which I have set to 4, and I could hardly hear anything but the music at certain points in the fight. It's good music, but it just needs to be taken down a notch in the source file. The bonfire is also in the same room as the fight, and unless you attack the sleeping sunless knights on your way back to Florian, there is no danger at all. After Jessa and Florian is the Keeper of the Old Gods, found where the old Dragon Slayer is in Dark Souls 2. Now I've got issues with this fight, and the changes that were made in the patch, which reduced his total HP by 600, lowered some of his resistances, and modified how his hyper armor works, didn't necessarily address what I think is the core problem with this fight, the boss's speed. So I don't have to keep saying Keeper of the Old Gods. I'm going to spoil the surprise and reveal this is Flynn, since it's easier to say. And he is voiced by Mr. Dark Souls himself, Vadi Vidya, which I think is a nice inclusion. But my problem isn't with Flynn's character, it is with his fight. As I said before, I have not played Sekiro, but I would assume that since this mod frequently uses animations from other FromSoft titles, and that Flynn has a katana and an Eastern style of fighting, that he uses moves from Sekiro. I don't want to beat a dead horse here, but it is integral to the criticism I am about to make. I do not think Sekiro is a Souls game. Miyazaki said it himself, and even from my surface-level experience with the game, I can see that there are plenty of differences between the core mechanics of Dark Souls and Sekiro. The biggest difference being the combat pacing, with Sekiro having a far greater emphasis on player mobility, parries, gear, and deflections. Naturally, this means that the movesets of enemies and bosses in Sekiro are designed with this difference in speed in mind. Now, I fully understand there are things from Sekiro or Sekiro-like features that can fit into Souls games when properly balanced or tuned. Malenia, and some of the content already in Archthrones, is proof of that. However, enemies and bosses that are this nimble are not going to work well at all, and perfect blocking and guard counters as they are currently implemented into Archthrones are not a direct replacement for Sekiro's deflections. Because of Flynn's Sekiro-like agility, the rate in which he attacks and moves far exceeds the player's own ability to react in most instances. For example, I perfect blocked Flynn countless times with a Great Shield, and hardly did it ever lead to opportunities for me to successfully counter him, as he would rarely be staggered. On the odd occasion he was staggered, it was never for a duration long enough for me to actually hit him with my guard counter without risking trading damage, and I was using a spear, a weapon class perfect for guard counters. Another issue with perfect blocking the boss is that it does not negate his bleed buildup, which rises quite quickly when using a shield. Again, because of Flynn's speed and aggression, eating a red moss clump without taking damage is borderline impossible unless he is charging a ranged attack in his second phase, or the player gets lucky and he decides to pause for longer than half a second, or not pursue them. This results in the only practical way of fighting Flynn being to parry him, and considering the developers placed the buckler right outside his arena, I think they also knew that. Sure, once you get the timing of the parrying down, the boss is manageable, but I think an unspoken rule of how bosses in the Souls series are developed is that you shouldn't have to parry them to win. Parrying has always been a mechanic that rewards the player for being skillful, not one that gatekeeps people from a fight because they haven't learned how to do it. Sure, you can sit there and say get good and skill check, but that ignores the point I'm trying to make. When has FromSoft made a Dark Souls boss that only consistently stopped attacking or moving when they were parried? One could argue Gwyn, to which I would say there is a massive difference between having narrow attack windows and having to forcibly create one using a mechanic I'd wager most players do not consistently use. Now you might recall that earlier in the video, I said that I found parrying the Gertrude Angels was a good way to fight them. Before anyone accuses me of being a hypocrite, I do believe there is a difference. Parrying the Angels adds an extra opportunity for the player to attack on top of their prior attack windows. Flynn does not regularly give the player a window to attack without having a high risk of trading damage. While Flynn does have moments where he slows down, in my experience these time frames where I could attack him without trading damage on my first or second hit were more uncommon than not. While the changes to his armor do help with this, I did find myself only ever getting the chance to hit him once or twice every now and then without much consequence while using the Iron Club. A weapon I am already skeptical might be a bit busted because of how easily it staggers things. Other weapons I tried against Flynn include the Gertrude Angel's Sword and Shield, a weapon which attacks very fast when one-handed, Janar's Halberd, the Winged Spear and Cathedral Knight Great Shield, Bastard Sword, and Halberd, all of which were only truly viable when parrying was introduced into the equation. Even though the Great Shield and Spear combo does seem like it could work with enough blood moss, patience, and luck, I found myself defaulting back to parrying. Why? Because it was quicker, not as risky as chewing moss, did more damage, and chained into a combo. If you parry one of Flynn's attacks, he will almost always follow up with another predictable one after you hit him, which I found to be the most consistent way to fight him. While all of that is bad, the worst part about this boss is he doesn't leave you alone, and the pillars hardly do anything to interrupt him. He can be on the other side of the arena, and by the time you pull out your Estus, he can close the gap and attack you, undoing most of the healing you have just done, or preventing you from doing so entirely. If you decide to reach for an Ember or Humanity, you could forget it unless he is charging up one of his ranged attacks, which clip through the pillars most of the time anyways. Deep down, I want to like Flynn. He has a unique appearance and an interesting character, but I think his fight needs a serious rework in regards to its pacing. In the rare instances where he wasn't chain attacking and instead reacting more to what I was doing, I found him to be very fun. I think a good way to improve Flynn would be to look at the fastest, human-sized boss in Dark Souls 3, Sister Frida. Frida not only can be parried and staggered consistently, but she can also be backstabbed. And in my experience, I was behind Flynn a lot. This would reward the player with a wider damage window, as not only could they get a critical hit should they successfully evade some of his quicker lunges, but they can also get a moment to heal or land a second strike as he stands back up. This alone won't fix the problem, and while it may promote backstab fishing, it's at least another way to kill him without parrying. Again referencing Frida, I think having Flynn also be slower and more cautious towards the player in his first phase would make for a better opening to the fight, and cause his sudden jump in speed to be far more alarming once he powers up in his second phase. I also think that his sprint speed needs to be slowed down, or at the very least, be delayed by a duration long enough for the player to heal once they are far enough away from him. Visually and thematically, Flynn is a good boss. His music is amazing and builds pressure throughout the fight. The arena gives ample space, but the pillars are borderline useless as he can fly around them or send ranged attacks through them. Another thing I noticed about Flynn that might be a bug is when he smacks into the player while performing a lunge, he can push them or drag them along with him, and this has led to my demise a few times, and it certainly never felt fair each time it happened. The changes to the damage Flynn did were also very helpful in reducing the boss's overall difficulty, and I think the damage that he does now is more reasonable considering he is one of the later bosses the player should face off at this point in the mod. The final issue I have with Flynn is how the fight ends. When his health bar reaches 0, the player gets hit by a scripted death, and upon respawning, the player can talk to him in the room at the back of the cathedral. This is annoying, and the first time it had happened to me, I thought the fight had bugged out. I see no reason why there can't be a patches moment like we see in Elden Ring, where the fight can come to an end without the player or Flynn having to die. Everything Flynn says to the player besides good morning can probably be said right there and then. If there is an issue with him becoming a vendor at this exact point, then implementing a voice line suggesting the player come back and visit him soon is a perfectly acceptable alternative. After that, reloading the bonfire can trigger him to move downstairs where he can serve the exact same role he does after he kills you. If that isn't possible, we see later with Janara, she does a similar thing, where she grabs the player and teleports them to a different area. Why not have Flynn do that too? It doesn't have to be a death, it doesn't have to be a grab, he could just envelop the room with fog and teleport the player. I understand having Flynn best the player is a way to show his strength, but I think having him sheath his sword perfectly unfazed after a fight you probably expended most of your healing materials proves the exact same point, only in a less frustrating way. My final thoughts about Flynn is I am thankful he has a bonfire right outside of his fog wall. If I had to go through the whole area each time, I'd probably have given up on him, to be honest. After beating Flynn, he sells 3 divine blessings, his ring, weapon, armor, and a horn which can be used to summon the Hide Phoenix when the player reaches the Tower Overlook bonfire. After using the horn, return to the first bonfire and head to the area the Dark Wraith is, and you'll find the boss. Speaking of the Hide Phoenix, this is a boss I think most would say is the final fight of the demo. Prior to the patch, I did not like this fight at all. To put it into perspective, I died a little under 20 times to Flynn on all 3 of my playthroughs combined. For the Phoenix, I lost track after 20 on my first playthrough, and I eventually gave up on the fight and made my second character with the sole intent of killing this thing, as respeccing wasn't available in the mod at that time. Like Flynn, this boss has had a fair share of changes made to it in the patch. Unlike Flynn, however, I think the changes made to this boss address most of the problems I had with it. To help paint the picture on how tedious this boss was prior to the patch, this thing never stopped teleporting or flying away from the player. Its damage would take a health bar of 1600, buffed by the Oracle Cinders and a flask of Great Embers, and drop half of it in just 2 or 3 hits. Now, post-patch, a health bar of around 1100 and a Nightblade's Kindling worked just fine for me. I personally think that there are still a few issues with this fight, some of which are however tied to how the boss inherently behaves. As for things that can easily be changed, the amount of stamina damage this boss does when blocking its physical strikes with a shield is actually nuts. Holding a great shield to even his lightest attacks resulted in me losing all of my stamina, and if you get hit by one of these light claw attacks, chances are you are going to get hit by another, as he will stagger you. On my third playthrough, very quickly I ditched the shield, switched to my follower javelin, and stick to dodging and strafing. As for the problems tied to the boss's behavior, that is how quickly you can lose track of what it is doing in its second phase, as it flies around and blasts spells, some of which you can't really avoid, as they are visually hard to see and have deceptive hitboxes. I do think that the many changes the team made to the fight make it bearable now, but I think more can be done to fine-tune it, such as reducing the stamina damage it does to shields, and modifying its collision so it doesn't constantly drag the player along for a ride when it's physically attacking them. The core premise of this fight is to let the boss expend its series of attacks before giving you a window to attack yourself. The ranged options of the Phoenix are limited in the first phase, where he can spew waves of fire your way and then lunge at you with an AoE. When you see him fly and cast a large fire wave, avoid the center of it because that is where he will land. If you properly time your dodges and stick to his sides, you can also attack him in between his own attacks in the first phase. Staying in front of the Phoenix will mess you up, as he can stun the player and drag them along with his movements. In the second phase, this is a bit harder as the Phoenix switches over to mostly ranged attacks. Once you enter the second phase, the Phoenix will fly off and bomb the arena. I found that standing next to the Fencer's corpse kept me safe from the barrage every single time. The Phoenix will then return and constantly change forms, and with each time it transitions, it will swoop around the arena and toss fireballs, which track the player when he morphs back into his lion form, and scatter when he is in his Phoenix form. These are not the easiest attacks in the world to avoid, because if you are too close to the Phoenix, at least 1 or 2 of the tracking fireballs will hit you despite rolling. Keeping a distance is the only way to avoid consistently being hit by these attacks, as they will either despawn or miss. But that being said, the Phoenix moves a lot and is quite quick, so keeping a distance isn't always possible. Once the Phoenix finishes its ranged attacks, it'll return to physically attacking, giving you a brief window to attack it before it charges up and explodes. While it charges up, you have an opportunity to get in a few more hits. Just try to stand at its back half so you can dodge away from the explosion once it occurs. After exploding, the process repeats itself. The worst attack that the Phoenix has, in my opinion, is the Fire Breath, which it casts while rotating around the player while flying. This attack tracks the player, and when rolling into it, away from it, or under it, almost always results in the player getting hit by the tail end of it. The only way I've consistently dodged this attack was by having already been running in the direction the Phoenix was coming from. Visually and functionally, the Phoenix bears some resemblance to the Sanctuary Guardian in the DLC of Dark Souls 1. When transformed, the Phoenix becomes, well, a Phoenix, and is nigh impossible to hit because of his smaller size and quick movements. The theme for the fight is bombastic and blends well with the thundering atmosphere. The arena is a wide, open circle that has one spot where the player can fall off. However, you will know you are close to the ledge because the ground shifts from stone tiles to wooden scaffolding. The run back for this fight is alright. It's a short run from the first bonfire, and standing in your way is a single Phoenix Knight and Disciple. You can jump the ledge or roll over it to get onto the platform faster, but sometimes you will land in the water if you poorly time it or get smacked by the Knight. Sir Florian could also be summoned for this fight if you have helped him out prior, though I didn't notice until after the fact, as I usually saved my embers for when I was in the boss's arena. The final fight at the Phoenix Tower is the Disgraced Knight, found in the dungeon at the top of the Profane Tower. The Disgraced Knight combines quick movements with delayed attacks and ranged guardian shivs. He also has Undead Hunter charms, which he tosses at the player to momentarily prevent them from healing. Like most other sword bosses, he can be parried, requiring 2 in order to get a critical hit. In the same manner as Flynn, the Disgraced Knight can be baited into a second parry after a first with relative ease. Unlike Flynn, however, this fight is entirely possible to do without parrying. The Disgraced Knight will almost always open with 2 shivs and a slam, an attack which can be dodged by moving to the side. The Knight leaves plenty of room for the player to attack, but be careful. Being too greedy with strikes might trigger him to land a guard counter or a kick. He also likes to trick the player into thinking he is going to perform a certain attack, only to spin around and do a different one, which is one of the harder aspects about this boss because it can throw off your timing. In his second phase, the Disgraced Knight buffs his sword with magic and becomes faster. He also gets various ranged magic attacks, which can be easily dodged but do massive damage if they land. The range on these spells vary, but most typically fizzle out at about half of the arena's length. The arena itself is fine, and is a long hall similar to the end of Earful Dungeon, flanked by 2 smaller areas with staircases. Going into these nooks is generally a bad idea, as the boss can trap you quite easily. The boss's theme is also wonderfully made, and added a lot of personality and flair to the fight, which I have read borrows mostly from the Owl's moveset from Sekiro. In my opinion, this is one of the better fights in the mod, as the Knight leaves plenty of windows for you to attack, but readily punishes over-aggressive playstyles. I think the Disgraced Knight is an example of something from Sekiro that does fit well in Dark Souls, as he attacks with predictable patterns at a pace comparable to the player's. The armor for the Disgraced Knight can be purchased from Erebus after the fight, and his soul can be transposed into his weapon at Andre. The runback for this fight is also a non-issue, as the bonfire is right outside the arena, and there are no enemies in the immediate area. Jessa can also be summoned for this fight, if you have assisted her prior. The last Archthrone that we can visit is my personal favorite one, that being the Throne of the Buried Giants. The area opens as Aleum Lois, my favorite DLC area from Dark Souls 2. Just as we are in that game, the player is warned to leave the city as we approach, the voice giving us an impression that we would again be meeting Aslana, the Silent Oracle. Outside the gates are 2 Outrider Knights, as in this timeline, Aleum Lois resides in the Boreal Valley, another one of my favorite locations in the series. I found the crossover between these 2 locations to be phenomenal, and to let the cat out of the bag, I am a sucker for snow areas. The peaceful snowy night, thin silver borealis over the forest, and distant chapel really sold me on the area's ambience the moment I entered. The Outrider Knights are certainly a deterrent to those wishing to enter Aleum Lois unprepared, which, in my opinion, is one of the last Archthrones the player should visit, as it houses much of the mod's harder content. The Greatsword Knight prior to the patch did an insane amount of damage. I'm talking 600 damage in a single swing with armor on. Post-patch, he is still a force to be reckoned with, but if you have a decent amount of vigor, you can survive a direct hit. The second Outrider Knight has a straight sword and a great shield, and is far easier to deal with than the Greatsword variant, who has incredibly wide swings on most of his attacks. If the player kills the knights near the 2 dormant golems by the gates, they will be activated by their souls. Behind the door is a Boreal Peacekeeper, a retextured Grave Warden who I want the weapons and armor of really badly, and the same can be said about the retextured Pontiff Knights and the Snow Witches found around the cathedral. Hopefully on the full release, we can get their sets, but as of now, they only drop the Rhymed Blossoms, which add frost damage to your right-hand weapon when mixed in an elixir. Rhymed Blossoms can also be picked up around the area, but they can be hard to see, as they are white flowers growing in a literal blizzard. Knight Slayer Tezorid can also be found in the cathedral, and will help the player with 2 of the 4 bosses in the area, assuming they help him first. Half of Aleum Lois is sealed by a gate, which can be opened after killing the first boss. Behind that gate is a rampart interior, similar to that of Stormvale Castle, or the first zone of Boletaria. Enemies here include a Mimic that drops an Estus Shard, Sunless Knights, and Silver Knights, all of whom drop their weapons and armor, in addition to some other things like Titanite. At the end of the ramparts is another boss, and after him, a maze of a forest filled with Farron followers and wolves similar to the Ashes of Ariandel DLC. This forest is one of the only areas in the demo that you can farm for large Titanite shards and also find it as a pickup on a couple of corpses. Other items of note in the forest are the Follower Shield, Javelin, and Saber, in addition to a large Crystal Lizard, the Northern set, and Hunter set. The first boss of Aleum Lois is Janora One-Eye, who yoinks the player upon their trespass of the cathedral and returns them to the passage they had just come from.
I can explain.
Like Aslana, Janora is an oracle that oversees the secret of Aleum Lois, which Tazorg is desperate to uncover. Janora is one of my favorite fights in the mod, and from what I've read in the mod's Discord server, she borrows attacks from the corrupted monk from Sekiro in addition to Champion Gundyr. Janora will undoubtedly punish anyone who instinctively rolls the second she begins attacking, as almost all of her attacks have long wind-ups or are slow moving. She is rather elegant, moving with a slow and steady flow unlike most other bosses. There are plenty of opportunities to deal damage to Janora, especially if you bring Tazorg along with you. She can be stance broken and riposted if hit enough times, but getting too greedy and trying to take advantage of her slow attacks will usually end with a trade in damage most of the times. In her second phase, Janora gains some momentum and envelops the arena in an obscuring mist from time to time. While the mist is active, illusionary images of herself will attack from random directions. After the volley is over, Janora will return to exactly where she was prior, allowing for the player to get in some good damage before she begins attacking again. Her usage of ice magic will drastically increase in her second phase, and she'll also begin going for more close-range swipes and spins. While overall I think Janora is a great fight, I do have two small issues with it. Her champion's charge being the first, and the number of times required to parry her in order to trigger a riposte. Her champion's charge attack does damage the moment it comes out, and not only does it do an insane amount of damage, it can also stun the player and isn't always immediately telegraphed. Gundyr's charge, while devastating, only stunned the player initially and built up damage as he gained momentum. I still think Janora should have this attack, but I think that modifying its initial damage to align more with Gundyr's would be a wise decision. As for parrying Janora, I don't know if this is because I'm not the best at parrying, or if it's just how Dark Souls 3 is, but I found the only way to parry Janora was to stand at a specific distance away from her and aim for one of her wider swings. Because of this, I found free parries to be a bit too harsh on the player should they decide to go down that route, especially since Tazorg could come in and completely mess up any opportunities you might have. Having her stay at 2 parries like most other bosses would be a nice change. Especially since the few times I was able to successfully parry her, she wasn't as easily exploited into a follow-up parry as Flynn or the Disgraced Knight are. I did also have some issues with the Zorg not always making it through the fog wall, even post-patch. The Zorg is a useful summon, but I did notice he hardly uses his shield and doesn't heal himself at all. While I understand he makes the fight easier, the Zorg sometimes will place himself in situations where he will get walloped without a chance to fight back, and he is prone to charge bosses when they are preparing an obvious area of effect attack, taking damage he really shouldn't. Visually, Janora is very well designed, and like everything else in Aleum Lois, I want her armor. Her halberd is also a powerful weapon worthy of the heavy stat requirement asked of it, and can be transposed from her soul at Andre. Janare's theme is also one of my favorites in the mod, and like her fight, has a smooth rhythm which grows in intensity as it progresses. Another thing about Janara is she is a voiced character, and like the rest of the cast, I think her voice actress did a great job. Finally, Janara's runback is one of the more annoying ones in the mod, as the closest bonfire is to starting one of Aleum Lois. Sometimes if you simply run past the Knights and Peacekeeper, they might follow you to the fog wall, and if you summon to Zorg, he sometimes goes after them if they are close enough. The distance of the run isn't bad, but if you manage to get slapped on the ass by the Greatsword Knight, you'll definitely be down a flask. After Janara is Silver Knight Captain Erdan, found in the Aleum Ramparts. From what I have read in the server, Erdan uses the Armored Warriors moveset from Sekiro, and like the Disgraced Knight and Janara, he is a fine example as to the kind of thing from Sekiro that does fit in with Dark Souls, probably because he himself is a knight. He is fast, aggressive, and has a deceptive windup on most of his attacks. The easiest way to fight Erdan besides parrying him is to strafe his right side. I enjoyed Erdan's fight, however I do think he should have a touch longer recovery time between attack chains to better fit with Dark Souls 3's pacing. As for the speed in which his individual attacks come out, I've had little problems with that. I suppose an argument can be made for his shove attack to be slowed a bit, but post-patch, I found this attack did modest damage and was more of a setup for Erdan to try and land another strike, which the player can effectively dodge quite easily. In his second phase, Erdan swings more wildly and is buffed with a Profaned Flame. Other than getting a few new moves, his attacks remain widely the same. Erdan's arena is a bit on the smaller side, but I did not find that to be a problem, as he can be lured back into the center quite consistently. Like most other bosses in this mod, Erdan punishes instinctive rolling. Dodging at the first sign of him preparing his sword will more often than not result in the player getting roll catched. Patience and timing is key with Erdan, and I think that is why his fight and Janara's are two of my favorites. Erdan's theme is also one of the best in the mod, and his armor is absolutely awesome. As for his sword, which can be transposed from his soul at Andre, I think it is a shame we can't use it with a stance comparable to Erdan's, but animating a new moveset is something that takes time, effort, and a lot of consideration, and probably is low on the priority list of things needed in the mod right now. The run back for Erdan is again non-existent, as the bonfire is 2 seconds from his fog wall. The third boss in Aleum Lois is Hattie and Skull, who are quickly recognizable as an Abyss Watcher and a Great Wolf from Ashes of Ariandel. The fight opens with the player fighting Hattie on his own. As one would expect, Hattie uses the Abyss Watcher's moveset as a base, but also has new moves to shake it up a bit, such as more kicks, spins, and swipes with his dagger. Halfway through the fight, Hattie summons Skull, the Great Wolf which he has become bound to. If I were to sum up this fight in one sentence, I would have to say this is what the champion's Grave Tender should have been. The dynamic between Hattie and Skull is well executed, and while both of them are swift and quick acting, both will rarely gank the player at the same time. For instance, Hattie will attack the player while Skull stands back, and once Hattie finishes his attack chains, he will tap out and Skull will take his place. This process repeats until one of them is dead. Skull uses the same moveset as the Great Wolf from the Ashes of Ariandel, but thankfully isn't as spastic and janky. I don't know if this is because the team modified his attack parameters, or if it's because the arena is flat and has less obstacles for him to glide around. Regardless of the reasons, Skull and Hattie were a fun fight, and were far better than what I was imagining they would be, as once I saw the Great Wolf, I was worried the fight was going to be ruined. The standoff mechanic is what makes this fight so unique and memorable, in addition to being its saving grace. The rework of the Abyss Watcher's moveset was also very enjoyable. The arena is beautiful and provides more than ample room for the fight. The theme was also phenomenally made, though at times I found it hard to hear because Skull was just that much louder than even the choir and bells half of the time. The run back for this fight isn't bad at all, and there is a bonfire in the Farron camp just outside the fog wall, and at most you'll have to deal with 1 or 2 Farron followers if they get in your way. The final boss of Aleum Lois is Kreml, the god of struggle. Kreml can be found in the Chamber of Frozen Chaos, and like with Janara, Tzorg will assist the player as a summon should they defeat Kreml in his own world first. Kreml is one of the best fights in the mod in my opinion. His first phase is characterized by slow and heavy swings and lunges with his hammer, as well as bursts of frost and the occasional grab. Kreml can also be stance broken, which when you add Tzorg into the equation, happens at least once or twice in his first phase. In an awesome callback to the Ivory King, Kreml will also periodically free knights throughout the fight. Now, I've seen a number of people complain about the knights in the mod's Discord server. The main complaint I saw surrounding the knights was that they were ads in a boss fight, and that wasn't fun. I think that's a subjective opinion, and I personally disagree with it. To me, a boss is a challenge, and if that challenge just so happens to involve minions that are incorporated in a creative and fair way, I am 100% okay with it. I'm a firm believer that not every great boss needs to be some guy with a sword and fancy moveset. Another criticism I saw of the Knights was the fact they couldn't be backstabbed and were relatively hard to stagger. I can't speak to this myself, as I purposefully avoided fighting the Knights, as I wanted them to be at their maximum strength when they sided with me once Kreml fully succumbed to the Profane Flame in the second phase. Speaking of his second phase, this occurs only after his health bar is entirely depleted. Kreml's second phase opens with him engulfing himself in Profane Flame. Any Knights that were still trapped are freed, and all Knights, regardless of if they were just attacking the player or not, will side with the player against a corrupted Kreml. I thought this was an amazing way to incorporate a callback to the Ivory King fight, and that the mechanic made the battle more thematic. Kreml replaces his frost with fire, and his eyes are overcome with flames, and it becomes abundantly clear that the Profaned Flame is similar in function to Madness in Elden Ring. I think this connection can be reinforced by the fact Kreml uses a flame attack similar to the Flame of Frenzy, but this painful usage of fire could just be something unique to him, as he is being corrupted by the Profaned Flame, rather than embracing it. Anyways, enough of my lore theories. Kreml gains some serious momentum once he is corrupted, and most of his attacks leave behind a lingering flame. The player needs to be involved with this fight. If they stand back and troll their thumbs, Kreml will certainly kill all of the Knights and Zorg. From what I've noticed, Kreml borrows moves from Radagon, Artorias, Champion Gundyr, and Gwyn, and shapes them into something entirely unique to himself. Kreml's theme is also one of the best in the mod. It is bold with somber chords, and is a great tone setter for this epic fight. The arena is the same as the one for the Ivory King, and is quite the spectacle with the frozen chaos as the backdrop. There is more than enough space in this arena. However, when Kreml does free the Knights, sometimes he does get stuck up in their cells. The only problems I have ever encountered with Kreml himself were prior to the patch, where sometimes after being riposted, he would freeze up until entering his second phase. Kreml, like Janara, needs to be parried 3 times in order to be riposted. That being said, Kreml in my experience is far easier to parry than Janara, as the requirement for the player's positioning isn't as stringent. Another reason needing free parries in this fight isn't that big of a problem is because, like Flynn and the Disgraced Knight, Kreml is easily chain parried. It is a gamble for sure, but one that is satisfying and rewarding to pull off. The most annoying thing about this fight is Zorg. Improvements have been made since the patch, such as moving his summon sign to lessen the chances he aggroes onto the Snow Witch outside of the chamber before the boss. I have still noticed that sometimes he doesn't enter the boss room despite being right outside the fog wall when I enter. Zorg also has the same problems he has with Janara. He makes little use of his shield, does not heal himself, and will rush Kreml when he is entering his second phase or preparing an AoE. I understand Zorg is not meant to carry the fight, but even in his own world, he at times is more likely to die than the player because of his recklessness. While many of my failed attempts fighting Kreml did come from me dying, just as many, if not more, happened because Zorg thought it would be a good idea to switch off his shield when a streak of attacks was coming his way. I think giving Zorg a flask or two, at least in his own world, would help negate the problem, as I know the Phantom AI in these games is a bit lacking, and that not much can probably be done about that. The distance for the runback for Kreml is not that great, but more often than not it'll result in the player taking fall damage as they try to leap into the first fog wall, or aggroing the enemies outside the perimeter. With that being the last of the content in the demo, I've got a few final things I would like to say about the mod. Earlier, when I was talking about St. Kilm, I mentioned the fact that the mod mostly features redesigns of bosses from the official titles, and that I would discuss this later in the video. Well, now is that time. Because Archthrones is such a radical transformation of Dark Souls 3, it is easy to forget that it is a mod made by passionate fans to the scale of a game, and that the resources and time they have at their disposal probably pale in comparison to a paid studio's. Because of that, I am perfectly fine with the fact that animations from other titles are being carefully sewn together to create new experiences. Animating and designing a unique boss moveset from scratch for every fight is in my opinion unreasonable for a small mod team that might not have many animators. There are more than enough existing animations to create new, complex, and memorable encounters, and I believe that Kreml, the Disgraced Knight, Obadiah, Hattie, and the Siege Golem are some perfect examples of that. As to why so many bosses borrow moves from only 4 games, I believe it has something to do with the fact that Bloodborne, Dark Souls 3, Sekiro, and Elden Ring are all made using the same engine and software. I'd imagine since these games are all made in a similar format, it is easier to transfer things like motion data and animations to existing armatures and use those, rather than have to build new ones. At least, I think that is what is happening here. I have reached out to one of the developers to gather more information on the animation process, but have not gotten a response as of yet, and that's fine. They are clearly busy people. I'll gladly amend the video if this information comes out, and I'll do the same for any other mistakes I may have made. Now, as for what content has been borrowed from the other games, I think that the mod developers overall did a great job at taking into consideration the differences between each title when selecting which animation to use. Elden Ring and Dark Souls 3, for instance, are the most alike, with Bloodborne being of a comparable pace to both of those, with the key difference being the player's primary dodge being a quick step rather than a roll. Sekiro is where things get complicated, as from what I have seen and been told, Sekiro is comparable to Bloodborne's pacing, but has a heavy emphasis on greater player mobility, stealth, gear, and a deflection mechanic, which does not translate directly into blocking or parrying in Souls games. Because of this, I think more care needs to be considered when borrowing from Sekiro over Bloodborne or Elden Ring. Bosses and enemies that heavily rely on Sekiro's deflection or test the limits of that game's expanded player mobility should not be included in Archthrones in my opinion. Comparing the agility and movements of the Ashen One, or in this case the Emissary, to Wolf is just laughable, so why should we expect the faster enemies of Sekiro to fit well in Dark Souls 3? The slower moves on the other hand is a different case, as we saw with Janara, the Disgraced Knight, and Erdan. Their movesets fit fine within Dark Souls 3, as their windows of attack leave enough time for the player to respond. Their movement speed is also comparable to the player's, and the pace of their strikes allows for enough time for the player to dodge or block them. Flynn is the only real problematic boss that borrows from Sekiro in my opinion, and while I can't give an exact formula on what attacks should and shouldn't be taken from Sekiro, I do think a general rule of thumb should be anything faster than the Disgraced Knight might be pushing it, and anything consistently the speed of Flynn is too much. Bloodborne may also have a similar problem, but because of how the player moves in that game, which is borderline identical to Dark Souls 3, and how the bosses are designed with a more Souls-like style of combat in mind, the only bosses with attack and movement speeds I can think of off the top of my head may be too extreme would be the Orphan of Kos and Ludwig in his first phase. But even those may be okay if they have their attacks mixed in with others. Archthrones is the most ambitious mod to date for Dark Souls 3. It takes content from existing titles and blends it together in a way that feels fresh. The new mechanics such as kindling add another layer of depth to the game, as do the features implemented from other FromSoft titles, such as guard counters and elixirs. The team has done a remarkable job making a new Souls experience so far, and though there are some bumps in the road, I think the mod is worth your time and attention. No game has ever been perfect. Someone, somewhere, will always have criticism about something. The idea, however, is to hear these criticisms and arrive at a point where the developers and broader community together feel as if the mod is in a good place. The 1.1 patch has done a great job at improving the mod, and if more people can get involved and continue to give feedback to the developers, especially on the mod's full release, I firmly believe Archthrones will be something the wider Souls community will greatly enjoy. The dedication and effort the team has put into this project is astounding. 4 years have gone into making Archthrones so far, and I would like to thank the team for their devotion to this project. As a massive fan of Demon Souls, a game I know many people have never played, I always found it quite unfortunate that some of the ideas and concepts that were introduced in that game never made it into any of the Dark Souls titles. Seeing that there is a team of people who share this respect for a game I think is vastly overlooked is quite heartwarming, and I am very glad to see that these concepts are being expanded upon in a more modern Souls format. If you haven't already, I strongly encourage you try Archthrones. The link to the mod's official website will be in the video description, assuming YouTube allows me to put it there. If not, you can find the mod at archthrones.com or on Nexus Mods. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe. I plan on making more content about Archthrones into Souls games in the future, and if you enjoyed what I had to say, your support would be greatly appreciated. By all means, tell me if I have made some mistakes, or if you agree or disagree with my analysis of the mod in the comments below. I'll always be open to any feedback or criticism you might have. Thanks for sticking around to the end of the video, and until next time, I hope you have a good one.